You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by a flashback. That's right, we're going back in time to episode 144 to chat with Matthew Heins about his book, The Globalization of American Infrastructure, the Shipping Container and Freight Transportation. We've done a lot of fun shows, but I'd forgotten about this one until I was actually on the plane writing down some of the old episodes that we've been doing, looking through some old episodes and seeing which ones that I might take inspiration from. And I was like, oh, I forgot about that. That one's an awesome one. And hopefully you guys find it awesome too. So we'll be back again next week. I was at Impact last week, and so it made it a little harder to do a regular Monday show. But we are going to be back next week with a guest, so stay tuned for that. Also, we're not going to do an election show this year, unfortunately. I found that my schedule caught up to me. I was at Impact until recently, and then also I just didn't have enough time. And also during the pandemic in 2020, we had a lot of free time to do stuff like plan an 8-hour extravaganza with multiple guests and multiple fun things happening. So I will try to do this again at some point because I thought it was a lot of fun. It's just a lot of work. So we won't do it this year, but hopefully we'll do it in the future. And as always, thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting the show. Join us. We've got a few new bonus features, including extra audio that didn't fit in shows with folks like Jillian Gillette. We posted an extra 10 minutes on the Patreon for subscribers, for supporters. So go check that out if you get a chance. Patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you can get a bus-only scarf. And also thanks to everybody who has been ordering scarves for the winter. We're sold out actually of the bike-only heavy scarves. So we have bus-only heavyweight scarves and we have bike-only lightweight scarves, but we're out of the bike-only heavyweight scarves, unfortunately. But if you want one, let me know, and we can gauge whether we need to do another printing or not. And so let me know if you're interested in one of the bike. They were very popular, I must say. We sold over 100 of those. So thanks so much for folks for following up with that. And also everybody's been loving them. And then winter is coming, so check those out if you get a chance. Go to theoverheadwire.com and you can find a link on there for all the scarves. And finally, all of our other merchant interactions can be found at the newly updated overheadwire.com site. Check out the boxes on the right to follow us on YouTube or find our Patreon. Also sign up for our free trial of the newsletter and get access to our archive with over 100,000 links tagged by topic and city. It's really awesome. Also, you get the daily newsletter with all of the news that we cover. And, on the Monday show, we don't cover all the news, just a couple of stories, but everything else, 40 or 50 news items a day. We go through 1,500 or so and pull out the best ones for you all. So I appreciate if folks sign up and check it out. And thanks everybody for listening and supporting. And, we're getting to Halloween, so be safe out there on Thursday. But let's listen to this first. Let's go in and listen to Matthew Heins in this flashback from 2017. Matthew Heins, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about yourself to start and your background.
Yeah, well, I never sort of planned on being a Renaissance man, but maybe I kind of wound up that way. My undergrad was in mathematics a long time ago, BA in math from Williams College. And then I did master's in architecture and urban planning from Georgia Tech. And then after working for a while, I did a PhD in architecture at the University of Michigan, which is where the book came out of, coming out of my dissertation on the shipping container. I'm originally from Massachusetts, and now after all this time, I'm back in Massachusetts. I was in academia for a little while after PhD, and now I'm actually working in urban planning now for a town in Massachusetts.
And you recently wrote a book specifically focused on the shipping container. Why did that topic speak to you specifically?
Yeah, it's strange. I started really thinking about sort of containerization and shipping containers back when I was in Atlanta, when I was studying architecture and urban planning. And I got interested in infrastructure and sort of globalization and also standardization. And to me, there was something fascinating about this very sort of generic, banal object, which of course does not really have any aesthetic qualities, so to speak. It's not the kind of thing that most architecture students maybe would find interesting. It's the complete opposite. It's the most sort of boring piece of metal you could imagine, just the basic sort of rectangular shape. But I was fascinated by kind of the power of how the spatial standard, these things were moving through the infrastructure, not just on ships, but on trucks and trains and passing through them. And just sort of the power of this infrastructural object and how important the spatial standard was in the way this thing was moving goods in a sort of a seamless manner, not just from a port to a port, but across all these different transportation infrastructures, on trucks and trains as well, sort of within the space of the nation state. So I think in the beginning is sort of just kind of an intuitive thing where I kind of had a sense that there was something really interesting about these containers. And it took me a while to kind of figure that out and sort of intellectualize it as a PhD student. But I think for me as an architecture student and planning as well, I was definitely interested in the spatial aspect and the physicality of them. And the fact that this is like a spatial system, that there's a standard size, and then it has to fit within the spatial systems of the other infrastructures as well. So it's just something that I really got interested in and decided eventually to do my dissertation on.
You talked about the term spatial regime in the book and reference Robert Moses making bridges too short for buses. What is it, spatial regime, and what prompted you to come up with this idea?
I came up with the idea on my own. It just sort of made sense. And then I found really only one other person whose name I forget, I'd have to double check, but one other person who had used it previously in a similar sense. Other people have used it sort of the phrase in a different sense. But it just kind of made sense to me as a way to think about the power of sort of a spatial set of standards or a spatial system. And again, sort of different from the way architects often think, where they look at sort of buildings as sort of individual masterpieces and works of creativity, and looking in a way that was more sort of politically and socially embedded in the world, but was still focusing on the spatial aspect of things as an architect, as a person interested in architecture and planning as well. And that sort of spatial aspect of things, whether it could be like the width of a pipe where like centimeters make a difference, or something on a massive geographic scale. Just this idea of the spatiality being so crucial, and how all these different systems that we have in the world, whether it's like the average width of a door, the requirement of a building code for the width of a corridor, how two different pipes sort of interlock, the width and height of roadways. In the case of the Robert Moses thing, the height that, say, a public transit bus would need to move, to travel under bridges, which in most cases, of course, civil engineers would sort of accommodate. But Robert Moses, because he was anti-public transit and racist, chose not to do so, or had his engineers apparently choose not to do so, although that's been debated. So I think for me, that was what was interesting about that. And I think it actually has a lot of relevance for urban design and transportation in general. So one can think of something like the complete streets movement or some of those standards where you think about, what is the basic standard that engineers use? How do those become taken for granted? Why is it that at some point we stop building sidewalks in a lot of our suburbs and all those sort of things? Or what is the width of a buffer between a sidewalk and the street? Is a median a spatial standard? Like how do those things, all of that kind of can be sort of a spatial regime in a sense.
The early planning for roads and the existing measurements that we had were kind of what set the tone for the containerization of goods movement. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Basically how legacy standards not get in the way, but kind of set the existing thinking for future changes that might happen in new infrastructure?
Yes, exactly. That was one of the things that was most fascinating to me. When I was first reading about the container, I learned that essentially the dimensions of the container were fixed at the global level, sort of over the course of the 1960s, I believe. But essentially where it originally came from was from basically the largest container that could be carried on a tractor-trailer truck on the American highway system as of more or less the late 1950s, sort of the late 50s, early 60s. And that's where it came from. That was sort of the constraint that created the American container, which then led to the global container, because the United States was so powerful at the time and had such an impact, because the U.S. had already created these containers that were already in use. And so this becomes this global standard. The other people who wrote about this sort of described it, but didn't necessarily find it all that interesting or didn't sort of see it as crucial. But for me, it was a fascinating example of the power of the American infrastructure at that time. This is sort of the post-war era of American power sort of at its global peak. The power of the American standards to the infrastructure And also just kind of the way these standards sort of are preserved over time and the level of history. Like a new standard is created, but it comes out of previous standards. And there is even sort of historical contingency and sometimes kind of a randomness as well. In other words, globalization doesn't sort of spring out of nowhere or out of some sort of invisible logic or some new system, but it does come out of pre-existing systems that sort of give rise to it in different historical ways.
Along those same lines, and kind of what you're talking about, you're mentioning, the shipping container as it's a global actor, for lack of a better term, but it's very shaped locally. Can you kind of reconcile those two things, the local versus the global? People are so afraid of globalization, but everything seems to be shaped locally.
So that was another thing where when I began the dissertation, I was thinking of the container for the most part in that way as sort of this global object that has this amazing power that's globalizing, part of the globalization of the world. When I began the dissertation, the hype about globalization was sort of at its peak, I guess. That book, The World is Flat, had come out recently and all that sort of stuff. And so that was my initial mindset. But the more that I got into the topic, the more that I did research and really started thinking seriously about how infrastructures work and how the container had really come about, the more that I realized it actually came out of this national condition in the United States, and that the way in which it works in different countries, my book focuses on the United States for the most part, or Canada as well, and North America. But of course, the similar thing would apply to other countries. The way in which containerization is implemented, the way it works in different countries, the way it works in railroads versus trucking, it all depends so much on national and local and regional factors. The pathways the container moves on, the way in which it has to interface with those national systems. So the container itself is this globally standardized object. It's the same thing, whether it's in China or the United States or Germany or anywhere. And yet at the same time, it has to fit within all of these local and regional and national things. And so those play a massive part in how containerization is actually implemented within all of these different places.
Yeah, and in the book, you talk about space versus place.
Kind of sort of a cliched comparison at this point, but one sort of a lot of scholars have talked about. And just this idea that a lot of the proponents of globalization would sort of talk about it as the sort of universal kind of matrix that dominates places and bends them to their will. The container and all these things from globalization, the internet or so forth, they're all sort of out there, kind of amorphous, and they sort of subjugate place, or places have to fit within that system, that sort of global system. What I felt was more relevant was it's really more of a back and forth interplay. The dimensions of the container actually emerge from a particular place. It's implemented differently in different places. So all those places, they're not losing their own particularity. They're accommodating the container. And in some cases, they are changed by the container, but they're also maintaining their own sort of character. They can't change the container necessarily, but they use it in their own ways. And I think especially in my example of Chicago, where you have this city that originally was 150 years ago, 100 years ago, is this massive hub of the railroad, the national railroad infrastructure in the United States. And now because of that, it's become a huge hub for container movement. And so sort of that aspect of Chicago's character and history sort of continues to the present, but it changes as the containers start to move through the city.
Yeah, the interesting stat from the book that I took away was the 300,000 people that probably work in some relationship to the shipping industry. And it made me think, we talk a lot about in urban circles, in urbanism on the Twitter or wherever else, about Chicago kind of losing population, but you have this huge port that's what you've said in the book was like would be counted as the third largest port in the world if you counted all the containers that were coming in and out. How does that reconcile itself, like the place of intermodality versus urban places that are for people versus like this shipping world that has grown up around the container?
Well, the shipping world is definitely, for the most part, and the container world and so forth, but the logistics systems, the sort of sites of interchange, the intermodal centers, as I guess I call them, and all these sort of distribution centers and massive warehouses. And you read about these massive Amazon warehouses. And all of those are definitely out on the periphery. They're in suburban areas or sort of even further in exurban areas. They're out in the sprawl. So in Chicago, traditionally, Chicago had these rail yards that were right in the city, not downtown, but pretty close to it. And gradually it's all kind of gone further out. And so especially if you're trying to get a large plot of land to establish some of these gigantic intermodal terminals, which really are massive, you really have to go further out. You want good highway connections as well. You don't want the traffic of the city. And so it all kind of keeps going further out, I guess you could say. But at the same time, you still have to be serving the people that are in the city or just in general that are in cities. I think I think the whole issue of freight transportation is interesting because we don't think about it nearly as much as people transportation. It's not as politically relevant. We don't actually do it ourselves unless we're truck drivers or in that sort of industry. We spend our time transporting ourselves, but the freight is actually really important. And so I think increasingly you have these places where the warehouses and the terminals are way out 10 or 20 or 30 miles beyond the city limits, but still the products do have to get into the city or into the other suburbs eventually. So it's an interesting sort of dichotomy, I guess.
And in a place like Los Angeles, where you have Long Beach and the terminals there, you have this massive amount of infrastructure that was been built for the trucking to just take the containers out from there to wherever their places of distribution are. And it seems to have a huge effect on people. I mean, you have huge discussion about particulate matter, for example, and freight pollution as it pertains to people that live near the highways and stuff like that. Is that something that you thought about when you were writing the book, or is that somewhat peripheral?
It's something I started to think about more towards the end in terms of some of the politics. Of course, that situation with Long Beach and Los Angeles is a particular example where they have major pollution problem, and the port really makes it a lot worse, all the trucking and all the operations of the port. But I was also thinking more broadly about just how the system of containerization is part of this rise of global freight. And it's sort of, in a sense, it's happened at the same time, and it's sort of entangled with the decline of American manufacturing, say, since the 70s, the rise of Walmart and the big box stores, the rise of this kind of rampant consumerism, products coming in from Asia, especially, and all these sort of issues of what are the politics of that is that, the container, along with the whole global logistics system, makes it possible to ship globally so cheaply. That's a crucial part of why American manufacturing kind of went down, and to some extent why we have sort of so much consumerism, also so much inequality, so many people impoverished, and sort of the working class has been decimated. So I was interested to think about a lot of those issues as well as I got into the project. A lot of those things were not things I had thought about at the beginning, but the further I got into the project, the more I became aware of them.
We're in this big national discussion about automation and job loss. And, in the book, you talk about the job loss at docks and the shipping workers that were pushed aside as the containers replaced them. They'd take stuff off ships, the dock workers, and then put it into a container or somewhere else to get it to market wherever it was going. But now you just have a crane that does that.
That was part of the reason for containerization in the first place. It was to reduce labor costs. The dock workers were had powerful unions with their histories. Part of the goal of containerization was to just reduce the cost of labor. In the end, the unions survived. And today, a lot of those crane operators make very good salaries. It's only like a tiny number of people compared to the old days, where you had a vast quantity of people. You watch a movie like On the Waterfront, you have all these sort of working class guys, hauling the stuff in and out of the ships, and that's no longer the case.
Is there something we can learn from that process as we go forward in the future, in terms of there's discussions about autonomous trucking and there's discussions about autonomous vehicles in cities delivering goods, and we've seen this process happen before from what you just described. Is there something we can learn from that?
I don't know. It's difficult. This is sort of going farther afield, but I guess for me, it does come down to sort of the politics in a sense and what sort of society we want. I think in the old days, the assumption was that if automation and all of those things would be a blessing, because then people would not have to work, or we would all work a lot less. But of course, it turns out the problem with that is that then we're still generating massive wealth. Only a few people get it, and everybody else is unemployed, I suppose, and sort of totally impoverished, until we can get a political system that's a little more comparable to the ones we had before, where there was actually sort of an aspiration to social income equality, social justice, and so forth. Looking at the history of containerization, I guess it's hard to be optimistic because it created some new opportunities, but it also threw a lot of people out of work. I think that's a hard question to answer. I think so much of it does counter to political and social factors. And obviously in this country right now, that the situation is not good.
I was particularly struck when you're talking about splintering urbanism, talking about equality in infrastructure. Can you kind of go through what that means? And are we on track for this in shipping goods and when we're thinking about, automation and human movement?
Well, one thing that interested me also with the container is that at the global scale, how different countries are sort of part of the global logistics system, for lack of a better phrase. For a lot of third world countries, it's very hard for them to be competitive because you really have to have a modern port that can handle sort of these massive container ships. You need to have the big cranes and all this sort of systems. Even if you have a lot of cheap labor, that doesn't necessarily do you any good unless you can create that sort of infrastructure capacity. And so places like obviously China and many other places have been very successful in that regard. But in a lot of third world countries, the rise of containerization was sort of harmful to them because it was hard for them to sort of get into that system and build up the port infrastructure, especially. They have the labor, but without that sort of port infrastructure. And so in a sense, at the global level, in some ways, it does sort of increase inequality, or at least there's the risk that it does. And I think as well, at the local level, when you see at the national level, automation putting dock workers out of business, you have the potential of automated trucks. You have a lot of these people working in the warehouses or working in trucking for that matter, sort of working in this global logistics system or working in Amazon warehouse and so forth, who are also, really poorly paid, impoverished and poorly treated and so forth. I don't think I have any easy answers. Like it's a difficult challenge.
I feel like I'm asking a lot of negative questions. I apologize.
That's okay. It's a challenge, I think, yeah.
What did writing this book make you feel about geographic boundaries, nation states?
I think I felt as though in some cases they're porous and in other cases not so much. When I began the project, I was sort of thinking in a more conventional sense about globalization, where all the sort of borders are becoming more porous and things are going through and so forth. And sort of, we're moving towards a closer world. As I worked on it, globalization began to recede a little bit. Well, I guess it really began with 9/11. And so in many ways, borders have gotten tighter. We've seen the rise of nationalism and so forth. Obviously, right now we're stuck with sort of our own horrifying example of a proto-fascist president in our own country and in other places as well. The rise in ethnic tribalism or whatever you want to call it. In many ways, tighter borders, more security requirements after 9/11, and more sort of maybe national identity. But at the same time, the containers can sort of go through all that, and global trade, I think, has continued to rise, or at least it's stayed very high. A lot of the sort of backlash against globalization and sort of the reduction, the return of nationalism, it really has not affected too much global trade. You still see tremendous global trade, containers moving through. And so the borders continue to be very porous, in my opinion, for global trade. And that's part of what the container does so successfully, is go through those borders so easily because it's this big unit that can be shifted, with the cranes from the ship to the truck to the train and so on. It goes almost seamlessly across all these borders. And so that has really remained the case. I think globalization can be a process where it can happen in some ways, but not in others. You may have all these global borders that are highly policed for security, but at the same time, you've got people on the internet who are, watching YouTube videos from other countries. You've got people buying goods that came in containers from Indonesia or all sorts of places. I think it can cut both ways.
What does this mean what do city-states, I should say nation states, different geographic boundaries mean for standardization of movement of goods and the shipping of goods?
I think standardization can take place without sort of any kind of global government, so to speak. Containerization happened partly because of the ISO, partly because the United States was powerful at that point in time. In a sense, you can still have sort of splintering and fragmentation and all these different national governments that sort of go their own way and maybe argue with each other. And yet at the same time, you can have something like the container that almost kind of insinuates itself into all these national spaces. And so I think on the one hand, you can have that splintering urbanism that some scholars talk about, Graham and Wood, and at the same time have this sort of global seamlessness in a sense as well. So it's almost a bit of a paradoxical perhaps. You can have them both simultaneously.
I noticed the word infrastructure permeated the book completely.
Yeah, probably too much.
Well, I don't think so, but I was just curious. Everybody seems to have a different definition of it, and I was wondering what yours was.
I guess for me, probably the definition by Starr and Roulette. I'm forgetting their first name. I think it's Susan Leigh Starr and Karen Roulette, maybe. They sort of have this famous, which they wrote in an article originally. It has 10 points. I guess at the most basic level, we've all heard infrastructure is defined kind of facetiously as you notice it when you lose it. And so the sense that it's this kind of essential underlying thing that you can take for granted. It makes everything else possible in a sense. If you don't have the roads, if you don't have the electricity, the water and sewer system breaks down, if the internet breaks down, suddenly ordinary life becomes impossible. I think of it in that sense, but also in the sense that Starr and Roulette talk about it. Infrastructure is this thing that both exists sort of universally and also locally. And so for me, that was actually a very helpful way to think about containerization. On the one hand, it's a global sort of a universal system. It's standardized. At the same time, it's a physical thing, and it always has to go through these local places. It's passing through countries, it's passing through cities and counties, and it's going down roads and so forth. And so that sense of infrastructure as being both universal and local, but each user sort of interfaces with it in their own way. And the way in which people use infrastructures becomes sort of socially embedded as well. Infrastructure always becomes entangled with particular local practices and social practices and qualities of sort of society as well.
And you mentioned interfaces. What are the major interfaces for shipping containers? Maybe I should ask, how many ways do they interact with the different transportation modes they ride on?
Yeah. So again, these are things that are very generic and banal, the kind of thing that you ordinarily would take for granted. They're not sort of technologically fascinating things. They're very ordinary. What makes them sort of special is what they accomplish. And really what they accomplish is to kind of make the interface between the global system of the container and the national system of the nation state. For example, with the railroad industry, you have these specially designed rail cars, which originally were sort of analogous to flat cars, which are designed to carry containers. And they're also designed, of course, to work in the American rail system. Like it's sort of a literal physical interface. And over time, the design of the rail cars became more sophisticated. They came up with these double stacking rail cars to allow containers to be stacked one on top of the other so they could still just barely fit beneath a lot of bridges and so forth. Then, of course, with trucking, you had a similar system where the American system of trucking, we have this system of tractor trailers, which I discussed briefly in the book. Container had to fit into that. So in the beginning, just sort of put containers on these flatbed trailers, which already existed. But then gradually they customized those to make them specially designed for containers as well. And so again, these are very generic objects. There's nothing technologically really exciting about them. They're not on the cutting edge. You would look at these things and you just sort of think, well, that's just a flatbed trailer. For me, in that sense, they are remarkable objects because they do make that interface between the global and the local in a sense.
A fun fact I got from the book was the etymology of the term tractor trailer. You say it a lot, or you see tractor trailers all over the country when you're on an interstate highway or something, but you don't always think about where these terms come from until you read a book about shipping containers.
Exactly.
In your research, did you find any other interesting origins that kind of popped out at you?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, I learned a lot about the origins of containerization, which really go back to the 19th century. These systems that they had in Europe and in the United States. Originally, it was smaller containers, and it sort of came out of two systems, I guess. You had people starting to move trucks and truck trailers and even like horse-drawn wagons on railroads. At the same time, you had these sort of boxes and crates that were gradually getting bigger and bigger, and people were starting to ship them between trucks and trains and canal shipping and so forth. And gradually the containers got bigger and they realized that they didn't really need a box car anymore. They could just carry the containers right on flatbed rail cars. So that was for me the most interesting origin. And I think for me, kind of a transportation geek, I guess, which I was while I wrote the book, and I guess I still am. It was just really interesting to write about the history of the American railroad system, the history of the American trucking system, and it had a relevance because the history of those systems is really relevant to then how containerization is implemented in them. In the book, I hope it's not just filler, but I think it really has relevance because then in order to understand how the container fits into these systems, you need to learn about their history in the first place. So that was something that for me was fascinating.
We've seen, or we've heard podcasts from Alexis Madrigal and on containers and shipping, and Mark Hogan here in SF always talking about them on Twitter, and somewhat as an annoyance because people want to build houses out of them, and it's a popular thing to talk about. But why are shipping containers such a popular subject right now? It seems like there's a bloom of information about them.
Exactly. And it seemed as though it began, I don't know, maybe about 10, 12 years ago, it started to become trendy. You had this book that came out by Mark Levinson, which I think was the first really sort of general interest book about containerization, which is a good book. It was a great resource for me. And I think that helped a little bit. I think just all the awareness about globalization really helped bring the container to the fore. I think some of the fascination is that it is such a generic object. And so people kind of got fascinated with how this simple thing can be used. And of course, it became sort of an icon of globalization, sort of an icon of global trade, I guess. Gradually, people kind of suddenly realized like this thing that we've been taking for granted is actually really important. For me, It's also interesting because doing it as a scholar of architecture, it seemed as though almost everybody I talked to wanted to talk about container architecture. What did Sugar Bond do with containers or low tech or some of these other architectural firms? They're always curious about containers being used for houses or repurposed for some of these other projects. Some of that stuff is quite fascinating. But that's really not what interested me about the container. And so I felt as though I sort of had to always kind of back up and explain, that's great. What I'm doing with it, what my research is doing is actually totally different from that. For me, what's really fascinating about the container is actually its intended use in transportation, as opposed to all these other incidental uses.
Yeah, you get this piece of quote unquote architecture or design. It's a box, and it gets co-opted away from its original intention, which is to move goods. It's kind of an interesting look at how ideas can come from many different places. Is there something that, when you started the research, you probably had a bunch of opinions that you had formed in your head just from looking or thinking about containers and why you wanted to start the research. Did you have any opinions that changed because of all of the work that you did and all the books that you read to put this piece together?
It's not just the research process, but the writing process as well, where as you write it, you start to sort of have to formulate your own ideas and try to make sense of it in text. And that's, so much of that thinking it through comes in the actual writing. I think the biggest thing is kind of what I alluded to before. In the beginning, I sort of thought of globalization as this kind of thing that sort of imposes itself and is making the world more interconnected. And I sort of had maybe a cliched sense of everything becoming more similar and the interconnections and all these different places having to fit with globalization. As I did more research and more thinking and more writing, I really came to realize that just wasn't the whole story. What makes the container successful, really, in a sense, sort of the key to the container success is the way it's able to function in all of these different places. You can have containers moving along the infrastructure in virtually every country in the world. Maybe with a few exceptions. All these places are so particular. They've got their own realities and histories and so forth, their own characteristics and qualities. And yet the container works everywhere because it allows for all these infrastructures and so forth. The biggest thing as I worked on the dissertation was to think of that. For globalization to succeed, it has to work at so many local levels, and every country and place is different, and yet it still has to sort of function in those places. So globalization is so much about that interface between the local and the global. The other thing that I realized more over time was sort of some of the political dimensions of it too, the way the container derived from American standard, how it was then used very successfully by countries in East Asia who built up their export economy, the way in which it played a role in the destruction of American industry to some extent. All of those things as well. That stuff was not on my radar screen, so to speak, when I began the dissertation.
Do you see a point ever where a shipping container is obsolete?
Well, that's a good question. I never thought of that. It's interesting. I think infrastructures, they hang around for a long time. At some point, somebody asked me to write about the telegraph, I think. And so I started doing some research about the telegraph. Telegraph more or less was obsolete with the telephone, I suppose. I'm not quite sure, but I would think by the 50s, not used that much anymore. It becomes obsolete. And yet it sort of survived for a long time. And I think there are a few places in the world where they still do use some form of a telegraph system. So I think infrastructures, they do last a long time because they're so embedded. I mean, you might come up with a new technology, but until you can change all these different standards and so forth, you need to sort of get rid of a technology that's no longer at the cutting edge. But an infrastructure is harder because it's so embedded in so many things, and especially transportation is embedded in our spatial world. I think eventually the container may disappear, but it's hard for me to imagine how. I mean, I guess that's always the problem. It's hard for all of us to imagine what could come. Maybe someday it'll no longer exist, but it's difficult for me to imagine like how that'll happen or what would replace it. I think as far as in the foreseeable future, containerization is definitely here to stay.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I thought it was a good conversation.
Talk